if you can talk the language of business first and instructional design, like in the room with the other instructional designers, you're going to win all day, right? People will value you, and you'll have more work than you know what to do with, which you'll feel overwhelmed on, but it's also measured that you're being really successful. So, I think that's sort of the way to frame it up.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Spencer Thornton, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Curation here at Open Sesame and the host of today's webinar. For those of you that are joining us that are new to Open Sesame, it's our mission to develop the world's most productive and admired workforces with the most comprehensive catalog of e-learning content from the world's top publishers, including several publishers that focus on strategic ways to embrace digital transformation in the workforce. A few housekeeping items to start. First, attendees are automatically muted. So if you have a question, please share it with us using the Q&A section. We'll be fielding questions throughout, and we'll save time at the end for Q&A as well. Next, if we don't get to your question live, please join us on Twitter and LinkedIn using the hashtag LearningUnlocked2021 to continue the conversation. And finally, this session is being recorded and will be emailed to you in the next day or so. So please be on the lookout for that. It's my privilege to introduce our special guests, Abby Lewis and Ryan Kerr from Harvard Business Publishing. Abby is a senior product manager with over 12 years of experience in digital learning and product development and management. She currently works in the content development and curation areas of Harvard Business Publishing's digital and blended portfolio. Ryan Kerr is a content development manager working primarily with the corporate learning division. He has designed and published a range of digital learning experiences that empower working professionals around the globe. Most recently, Ryan led the development efforts of several new course topics, such as managing stress, personal productivity, and digital intelligence. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here today.
Great, thank you, Spencer. It's great to be here today. And sorry, I'm experiencing an echo. 1 second. Sorry about that. Thanks so much, Spencer. Really excited to be here today to talk with all of you about digital intelligence.
Yeah, and appreciate you having me as well. It's great to be here. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. I'm excited to dive into the topic.
Great. So before we get started today, we wanted to share a bit about who we are at Harvard Business Publishing. Our mission is to lead with ideas. We are dedicated to being the trusted source of the most important and provocative ideas influencing us today and in the future. And in the learning division Ryan and I work, our focus is really on developing solutions and learning experiences that help our clients solve some of their biggest challenges and prepare their talent for the future. One of the ideas that we've been focusing on a lot recently is digital intelligence. And before we get into what we mean by digital intelligence, I'd like to talk a bit about why we've been focusing here. And that goes back to the double disruption that we've all been experiencing for the past 15 or so months. Digital transformation, along with the global pandemic, have really accelerated the pace and degree with which technology is transforming our work and our society. Happening is only increasing as a result of the pandemic. We know this is the with our client-facing team on what we call the Global Listening Tour. We spent this time talking to 47 talent and learning leaders around the world. You can see we were in North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, India, the Middle East, Australia, and New Zealand. And the goal of this tour was to do two things. First, to understand the business impact the pandemic has had on organizations. And then from there to understand, what does that impact mean for leaders? And specifically, what is the impact on the leadership capabilities that are most critical to leaders? So we learned a lot through this tour about how leaders from various industries were responding to and adapting through the pandemic. And one of the biggest takeaways from this tour was that most organizations we interviewed had seen an acceleration in digital adoption and opportunity, both within their organizations and within their customer bases. Many companies were applying technology to speed up processes and bring products and services to market faster during the height of the pandemic. For example, one real estate company had to start using a totally new virtual sales process for home showings and purchases. A telecom company had to take its technicians out of the field, which led to innovations around new ways of leveraging virtual technology to service clients safely. So we heard endless stories like this. As companies tried to reinvent their business for survival, digital took on a new sense of urgency, and many organizations realized that they could make the transition to digital much faster than they thought. So with all of this context, we began to think at Harvard, how could we set our clients up for success? How could we help them prepare their talent for the monumental changes that they were going through? And that led us to begin focusing on digital intelligence.
Yeah, so jumping in, thank you, Abby, for that intro. Throughout our time together today, we're going to be pausing briefly here and there to pull all of you into the discussion as well, to get your thoughts and get a sense of how you're experiencing some of these challenges as well. So I just want to take a moment. There's going to be a poll that's put up in chat to hear how you. Do you have initiatives that are ongoing, discussions, or is this not a priority for you right now? So feel free to weigh in on the poll in chat. We'll give a moment just for those answers to come in. Thank you so much for all of your responses so far. I would just ask Vern or one of the other great panelists here to maybe give us a sense of where those answers are coming in.
Yep, just give it a couple more seconds here. Getting a lot of responses.
Yep, the responses should be published shortly.
All right, I'll just give it another couple seconds here.
And apologies, if a team member from Open Sesame could help me get a sense of the responses I needed to drop from the Zoom for technical reasons.
Oh, I can see them, Ryan.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I'm back in. It looks like we have an interesting split, about three-way between we're in the middle of digital transformation with a clear end goal to we're always considering how digital transformation impacts our business, and then a little bit less on that there have been discussions about digital transformation, but no formal initiatives. And only a few folks saying that digital is not a priority for them right now.
Excellent. So that tracks a lot with what Abby was just talking about what we heard from the field and the clients that we spoke with. And I think that spread speaks to kind of how, as we enter into this post-pandemic world, all of our organizations are thinking about tackling this issue in kind of a different way. But that's encouraging to hear that it's on everybody's radar. So with that said, let's dive into kind of the purpose of today's talk today, which is to chat a little bit about a framework that we created here Harvard Business Publishing, that has driven a suite of new learning experiences for our clients. As you may have guessed, of course, that framework is digital intelligence. Now, this is a term you may have some experience with before, but we have kind of put a unique spin on it here at HBP for our career professionals. You can see a broad definition up here on the screen. We see digital intelligence as encompassing key skills that are social, practical, and personal, that everyone in an organization needs for that organization to be digitally ready. That organization to succeed in navigating through digital transformation. You can think of it as kind of the fuel for larger scale efforts. So this isn't something that just the C-suite or just executives would be focusing on. This is for leaders at all levels. You may have been aware of, maybe even taught similar frameworks at your organizations, such as digital fluency or digital literacy. This is really HBP's spin on that. And we see it as broader than just using any one technology, but much more a suite of deeply human skills. So as you can see here, it's not just about the technology, the title of our talk. Digital intelligence is way more than that. So we have broken down kind of the capability into 4 different skill areas. The first and kind of the foundation is all about culture and mindset. This is how you think and work together when it comes to technology. Second is, security and privacy. So growing increasingly relevant the more information we're all creating together. We need to understand how to control that information and be responsible with it. The third is all about data and analysis. The idea is, since we're all creating this information, both as consumers and as professionals, what do we do with it? How do we act on it in our roles if we're not data analysts, or maybe if our organization doesn't even have an analytics team? And lastly, of course, the tools and technologies themselves are crucial. Not only acting with them, but also an awareness of them and how they relate to our role. So here at HBP, we come up with these kind of frameworks not independently. We don't just doodle them down in our journals and call it a day. We reach out to experts kind of across the field. So this digital intelligence framework was created with professionals not only from Harvard Business School, of course, and our partners at the Harvard Business Review, but also with practitioners' help. So people in tech, people in data, just getting that kind of first-hand experience of what are the suite of capabilities that people need to succeed in these ways. So these are just 6 individuals that helped us put all this material together, but know that there were many more that we consulted as going through it. So today we're going to walk through each of these 4 skill areas. And we're not going to just share kind of what they're about and some practical tips for how you can bring them to your organization, but we're also going to touch on kind of brief stories that bring each of them to life. Some of these stories are going to be really personal to Abby and I about kind of what we've gone through during the pandemic, but others are going to be from organizations kind of around the world. Yes, and as I kind of briefly hinted at, each of these stories are in some way related to how we've been challenged in the last year by the pandemic and how digital intelligence has helped with that. So as Spencer mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be pausing to hear from you as we proceed. But if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A function. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end to get to quite a few. All right, so the first that we're going to tackle, the first skill area is all about culture and mindset. So this is really the foundation upon which the rest of the skill areas sit. Because if you don't have kind of how you're thinking about all of this in a good place, or how you're working together around technology, it's going to be hard to act in successful ways with your organization. So what actually do we mean by culture and mindset? So 2 kind of main components to this skill area. One is very personal, very individual. It's how you open yourself up to new experiences and how you think the technology around you. When your boss or coworker comes to you with a new way of doing something, do you kind of roll your eyes? Do you say, like, I don't have time for that? Or do you at least have some element of openness? This is kind of the mindset that we're talking about. The kind of second half of the equation is taking a step back to the broader community. How do you work together with your team through technology? How do you communicate and model behavior to others? Just broadly, that kind of sums up this skill area. We're not going to be, of course, teaching, an exhaustive course on each of these skills. We can do that for weeks, and I'd love to. But we are going to just give you some quick hits that you can take with you. So you'll see on the next slide are just a few of the habits that somebody who's channeling that mindset and cultivating that community will have. Like I said, that first is all about this openness to technology, this interest and excitement first, rather than hesitation or intimidation. Second one is thinking of technology as something that can connect us, rather than just, a bridge that doesn't really work that well. So when we think of going remote, we think of, oh, this is a cool opportunity to communicate in new ways, rather than, oh, this is a shame. The third habit that you might see is that you're always interested in learning new things and experimenting. So when you think about a new tool or technology, you're not like trying it out because it sounds cool, but you're thinking, oh, this might be interesting. I want to experiment with this in my role. And the fourth is always putting the customer first when you're thinking about technology in these ways, making sure that their needs, the user, your client, comes first before any sort of other reason to adopt a new digital practice. So to show this in action, we're going to give you a little behind the scenes look at how HPP, Harvard Business Publishing, was communicating during the pandemic. So I'll shoot it over to you, Abby.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so like many organizations in the US, HPP closed our offices in mid-March of 2020 and everyone began working remotely. And obviously this change came with some challenges for us, some purely logistical ones, like how making sure everyone's set up to work remotely, and more nuanced challenges like balancing work deadlines and full-time childcare, things like that. But the pandemic also raised a question for us that I think many organizations are grappling with today, which is how do we maintain a sense of connection and culture and purpose across our organization when we can't be together in person? Fortunately, at HPP, we did have a foundational digital culture that could be adapted to meet some of the challenges that the pandemic brought. And I would like to share a couple of examples of how that happened. I'm sharing these examples not because we are experts in digital culture. We definitely weren't at the time, but we were learning as we went, and I'd like to share a couple of those stories. So at the start of the pandemic, we began having weekly all-staff meetings that were led by David Wan, our CEO, who you'll see on the next slide, and some other members of our executive team. And initially, these meetings were really pretty logistical about sharing information about how we're faring as a company and expectations for balancing everything in this new normal. But over time, as the meetings went on every week, it began to foster a really strong sense of community and purpose for our organization. I think it was something about seeing these executives who some of us didn't work closely with before on a regular basis in a much more intimate setting in their homes week that really made a difference. And often other teams would join to talk about what they were working on, how they were adapting, how they worked due to the pandemic. And while there were plenty of heavy topics to discuss, we also heard updates on what David had made for dinner the last week and things of that nature. So again, it really set the tone for how we were going to navigate through this pandemic as a company together. And it really, I think, created a strong sense of shared purpose across our organization, perhaps even stronger than we had before the pandemic started. And on this slide here, you see some of the Slack channels that some of our more inspired colleagues created. These happened pretty organically in the early days of the pandemic, where different people set up channels on things like working parents, how to help your fourth grader with his homework, as well as how to care for yourself and others, managing things like anxiety and stress and grief. And also lighter topics just like, let's share a photo of our dogs because it makes everyone smile. So I share this story because I think it's an interesting example of how Slack was really transformed from a tool that we use to communicate really about deadlines and projects and things like that to a much more robust community forum that fostered connections among our colleagues across the globe. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the challenges that you have encountered in your organizations in terms of developing a healthy digital culture? And if you've overcome those challenges, how did you do that? And while we wait for your responses, I'll just quickly touch on the takeaways for digital culture. As Ryan said, we really have to think about this as something that's everyone's responsibility to cultivate. And when it comes to technology, thinking back to that Slack story, think about how you can use it to really build communities. It can go beyond communication. And finally, when you're faced with a challenge that disrupts how you work, think about it as an opportunity. How can I help you explore new ways of working using technology? I'm going to see if we got some couple of responses. Sherry says, presenters having a fear of the camera. Yeah, it's definitely a change. Pre-pandemic, I don't think there was such an expectation that everyone was always going to be on camera, but those days have changed. Karen says, we had weekly meetings for an hour. We did not talk about work, but other topics such as family and fun stuff that we're doing. That's great. Cindy says, just started a company where their leadership is having challenges leading and they do not know where to start.
It's certainly a challenge many organizations are facing.
Yeah.
And I think one of the best ways to overcome it is just connecting with each other, hearing what other organizations are doing that have been successful. As Abby mentioned, our story of what HPP has been doing is not to say that we've been perfect, but it's just to emphasize that it's so important to hear what other people are doing, what works. This is new to all of us, and it will continue to be new as we enter into more of a hybrid work setting than we ever have had before in kind of the post-pandemic world.
Right. Well, thank you all so much for weighing in.
Yeah, so we can jump on to the next kind of skill area here, which is privacy and security. So you might hear that kind of title and think, okay, cybersecurity, next, I got it. Which is sort of what I thought originally coming to the topic. But as I dove in, I realized that it's so much more than just thinking about cybersecurity. And it's something not just for your IT team or your information security department, but it is something that all of us need to focus on. So let's walk through kind of 4 main areas of skills for this topic. The first, yes, is all about information security. It's about habits that you and your team can do to make sure that you're protecting not only your organization, but also yourselves from any attacks from elsewhere. Second kind of skill, though, that we want to think about is more about people and connection. Tech enables us, as we were just talking about, to communicate in new ways. And that's fantastic, but it also means that we need to be thinking about boundaries in new ways. When you have access to, let's say, the Instagram account or Facebook account for everyone in your organization, that begs the question of how much you should be considering the privacy of others. It also touches on if you have a boss that might be monitoring some things you're doing, if you're monitoring others, where are those lines? So that's really an important thing to consider and think about. Third kind of skill that we want to chat about is this thing called, many of you may have heard of it, called data exhaust. So the idea is we're all creating so much more data these days by emails and messages on Teams or Slack, creating documents and sharing them online. This creates this exhaust that follows you around, and you need to understand how to make sure you're controlling it in a safe way, so that untoward folks don't grab it and use it for nefarious purposes, or it just gets in hands that it shouldn't be and creates kind of confusion. The fourth habit that we want to think about when it comes down to privacy and security is all about our customers, our users, people that we're serving. How do we respect their privacy? and their information that they're providing us, which is so key. These ethical questions that companies are facing that they've never had to before. So just this next slide will sum up those kind of 4 skills here for you. But as you can see, it's more than just thinking about how many characters your password has. There's a piece of it there, but it's so much more than that. It's tackling new challenges and being aware of them that we've never had to deal with before. So there's a great quote from Lakshmi Hansbal, who is the global chief officer over at Box. And she says, companies need to weave trust throughout their entire ecosystem and make security part of every job description. I love this quote because it not only flags the fact that trust is so important, which comes from this transparency and acknowledging these new boundaries, but it also mentions that it is part of everybody's job. Like, this is not just for your IT team. This is something that you need to make sure teams in your organization are thinking about on an individual level. So let's make it real. Let's kind of see this in action. So I want to chat a little bit today about Lollapalooza. If you haven't heard of it, it's a music festival here in the US. It draws several 100,000 people a year. I think there are 400,000 or so in 2019. And it takes place in Chicago, has been going on for 20 years. And they are facing an interesting challenge this year. They were forced, of course, to cancel the event last year with the events of the pandemic. And they're excited to bring it back this year. To do so, though, they are requiring that every attendee submit proof of vaccination. So suddenly you have a music festival who has experience in collecting some personal information, but suddenly is faced with a whole new type of information, medical records. Assumedly, they don't have the infrastructure to support that type of data. So what sort of questions do they need to ask themselves, and how are they going to overcome that hurdle in a way that is both ethical but also logistically makes sense for them? So before kind of talking about how their story is ending and what they're planning to do, I would love to turn it over to the group for a sec to kind of get your thoughts. There's going to be a poll in chat kind of outlining this question of what should their team do to handle this new sensitive information. There's going to be a few options there. Select the one that you think would be the best option for them. There's no right or wrong answer necessarily. And of course, we don't have all of the information on the situation, so do your best. But I'm just curious to see what everybody's instinct is on the right play here. So I'm going to pause for a moment. And then, Abby, I would love it if you could share kind of where the responses are coming in.
Sure.
All right, just give it a couple more seconds here.
Just waiting for them to come in now.
And I can't speak for everyone on the call, but I imagine there's a lot of excitement about returning to events like these. And I think that this is a great example of an event organization having to deal with this struggle. But I think that there are a lot of similar organizations that are tackling these new types of information as we realize what this post-pandemic world is going to look like.
Okay, I have the poll results here. It looks like the most popular choice was they should have their team undergo training before collecting new sensitive customer information, followed by they should ensure internal experts in information security are contributing to the project.
Excellent. I love that.
The most common, yeah.
Yeah, and as I said, there's no gotcha there. If you chose one that wasn't too popular, don't worry. The important takeaway here is that there are a lot of different ways to tackle these problems, and you need to make sure that you are addressing them. If the one wrong choice for Lollapalooza would be to look at this and say, oh, this won't be an issue, and to just not really think about the fact that this is really sensitive information that they need to be respectful of. So let's see what they are actually gonna be doing. So If you jump over to the next slide, you'll see their kind of route that they're taking to tackle this problem is they're working with the city of Chicago to develop an app called VaxPass. You may have heard of it. Other cities are starting to use types of apps like this. What it will do will actually make sure that Lollapalooza as an organization doesn't have direct access to these medical records. It's going to connect Lollapalooza with those holders of that medical information through the app. So they're using this technical solution to kind of acknowledge, okay, we don't have the infrastructure to support this new information. Let's solve that through this external vendor that they have trusted with the city of Chicago. So it's just one example of how privacy and security is going to be influencing how all of our organizations are making decisions. But to bring it down to kind of your team level or tips that you can give teams in your organization, just have a few pieces of advice here, things that you can do. Make sure you're holding discussions and workshops. Or encouraging your teams to that draw attention to what sensitive data you have access to. I think regardless of your role, you'd be surprised when you really think about it, what information you have. Also, make sure you're modeling good habits, the habits that your security teams or IT teams are providing you. Make sure that you are being a good example and not putting that Post-it with your password on your computer. Additionally, these standards and these habits need to be something that everybody does. So if you notice your boss not doing it, or if you notice your report's not doing it, or peers, make sure everyone is held to the same level of accountability. And of course, while we mentioned it's not just IT's responsibility or your security team's responsibility, they are great resources. So make sure you're taking advantage of them and communicating with them if you have any questions. So we're going to move on now to the third skill area. Abby, you can take it away.
Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, from here we want to turn to data and analytics, which is really the third piece of this puzzle. I think the story that Ryan was just telling really gets at the fact that we're all exposed to so much more data these days, and sometimes sensitive data. In fact, I saw in the chat, James was saying this type of information, we are balancing doing it in-house, which is doing it safely and being responsible to those who give that data. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of responsibility to keep in mind here. When we think about data as a capability within digital intelligence, the key thing to understand here is that you don't have to be an expert in data. You just need to be data literate. And what we mean by that is that you need to have enough foundational knowledge to use data to inform and improve your decisions. How to effectively use data is a really broad topic, but I'm sure we can all agree that everyone at our organizations needs to be thinking about data and taking actions based on relevant data. But how do we go about that if we don't have the expertise, if we're not data analysts? Well, we think about this in terms of the 3 A's that you see here. So access. How will your team identify and find data that's relevant to your projects? Accuracy is getting at how will you determine that the data that you have is valid? And finally, analysis. How will you interpret and actually act on the data that you find? So with that, I'd like to take another sort of behind the scenes look at Harvard Business Publishing and share a story about this time the team that Ryan and I are on specifically, how we faced a challenge due to the pandemic and used data to get in front of it. Again, I'm sharing this example not because we are perfect models of digital intelligence by any stretch, but rather I want to share an example of how data affects real teams. So in March of 2020, we were in the middle of developing new courses on change management and time management when all of a sudden the world just really changed. And we knew that as a result, the needs of our learners were changing too. So the questions we were asking ourselves were, what do we do next? How do we make sure that what we're building is meeting the needs of our learners in this time of just complete crisis? So we had some assumptions around what our learners would be looking for, but we really needed data to inform our decisions about if and how to pivot. So what we began to do was look at the data for all of our courses to see how it was shifting. And as you'll see on the next slide, we saw a really massive increase in 2 courses specifically, crisis management and stress management. You can see a percent increase here for these courses, comparing 1 week in March to a week earlier in 2020. And, the usage was just really nowhere near it had been for either of these topics in the past. So that was definitely a clear sign to us. We also have data on the articles and videos on harvardbusinessreview.org to see what's popular there. And we began to hear from our clients as well about what they were looking for. And all of it sort of aligned with this idea of managing stress, communicating in a crisis, things of that nature. And again, that wasn't a huge surprise to us because, we understood to some degree what our clients were going through. We did have those initial assumptions, but the data was still extremely valuable to us for 2 reasons. One, it validated the need. We didn't want to make big changes in our plans based on assumptions alone. So it really validated our assumptions. And also because the increase in usage was so astronomical, it really imparted a sense of urgency to us, to our team, to realize that this is something that our learners and clients are really looking for. And it helped us make the decision that we were going to pivot. Before we did that, though, we did spend a little bit of time with our data analytics team to make sure that we were interpreting everything correctly. And then we had to decide, what are we going to do with this data? It was tempting to use some of the data on other topics that were popular to validate the direction we were already going. But ultimately, we decided that we did need to pivot. And we began working on updated versions of these topics on a really accelerated timeline. We also were covering things like remote working and things like that. So the outcome of this was that we got a lot of really positive feedback from our clients and learners. And as you'll see on the next slide, these are real quotes from some of our learners around the updates that we made. It was positive because our clients and learners saw that we were responsive, and it felt positive to us to be able to be responsive and to help our learners and our clients in a time of such stress. And the data, the key point here is that the data really empowered us to do that. The data empowered us to pivot. In that sense, it was extremely valuable. So, Brian, go ahead.
Just a quick note. I always laugh when I see some of these because it does look like they're written by our marketing team. But it was really cool to hear actual learner and client responses to the fact that we jumped on this as quick as we could, and it did seem like it was making an impact, which really validated our use of the data.
Yeah. So at this point, we'd love to hear from you. What strategies has your organization or your team adopted to make acting on data a priority? Ryan and I can speak from experience that it's not easy to build this into your work. Of course, it's really important that you do so.
Mm-hmm. And as you're chatting in some responses, just that finding time piece, it's when we think of access, that first kind of principle to think about, that's what it's about, is making sure that there's somebody on your team, even if they're not an expert, that is responsible for asking these questions and knows who are the experts they need to go to. So.
Not seeing any chats yet. Maybe in the interest of time.
Yeah, we can always turn it back.
Yep. Great. So the next slide is just, again, going back to the questions that you should ask yourself as you're looking at how you can take advantage of data. Think about the questions underlying each of these elements of access, accuracy, and analysis. I see a comment from Stephanie. We recently revamped our learner surveys to collect more valuable feedback we can use to improve our training. That's great. And Allison says, making data a KPI for stakeholder sharing. That's great. That's feedback that we honestly get a lot in our stakeholder meetings about making sure we're putting the data front and center. Great. Well, thank you both. And I think from there we can turn to our last topic, tools and technology.
Yeah, so this is the last skill area and probably the most obvious of all of them. So this is all about, all right, what do you actually act on as far as taking in new tech? And if there's a big kind of organization-wide initiative to adopt a new tool, how do you do that? So we're not necessarily going to answer that in detail today, but we are going to give you hopefully some help to get you started. So when we think of tools and technologies and the skills that you need, it really comes down to kind of 4 categories. First is the awareness. So you need to have an awareness of the emerging tools in your field. Doesn't mean that you need to be an expert on them, but you need to understand what is currently going on in the world and how might it be relevant to you. So you might hear about something like blockchain. That might not be relevant to you at all. You need to have an awareness of what will impact you and what won't. Second, when you think about tools and tech, we touched on this briefly earlier, but you need to think like a scientist with it. So this can be just on your team, taking in a new way of looking at spreadsheets or a new way of tracking time. Make sure that you're not just overcommitting and saying, okay, this is how we're going to do it. You have measurements in place to say, oh, this is actually making us more effective in some way, or it isn't. We're going to try something else. Third, think about it not just in terms of organization-wide initiatives. This can also just be personal initiatives or just initiatives on teams. So make sure that your organizations know that, if you're experimenting with a time tracking app, that is thinking about tools and tech in this way. And fourth, which is one of the most nuanced but important, is thinking about how much experience and knowledge you need with a given technology to be successful. Abby and I work with both front-end and back-end developers all the time. How much programming do we need to know to be successful? Probably not too much, but probably we need to have an understanding of where they're coming from and what limitations they have. So I'm going to introduce a story actually through a video this time. We sat down with Felicia Jadczak from an organization called Geeks Out last year. She and her organization work to connect women and underrepresented individuals in tech kind of through networking. They try to create opportunities for each other. So she's going to chat just briefly about how their organization faced a challenge in the pandemic and thought about how to use a new tool to overcome it.
When we initially had the pandemic hit, my company, Geeks Out, was focused pretty much 100% on in-person gatherings. We have 2 sides to our company, and so we were holding in-person networking events, and we were also holding in-person workshops and trainings for various clients. The good news was that we were already leveraging several different technology platforms that allowed us to communicate, to use video conferencing, chat with each other. So that was not something completely new for us. And so we really leaned into a lot of the existing platforms we were using. And what we found was that for trainings, workshops, seminars, webinars, things like that, it was really easy to a certain extent to just really lean into technology. On the other side of the house, though, we were holding these different community events. It was much more challenging because the whole point of these events was to come together and be in person together. And so we took a look at several different platforms that were out there to really get a sense of how can we find something that will allow us to have more of that two-way relationship between ourselves, our speakers, and our community members, so that it's not just a one-to-many kind of talking at a group of people, but really more of that hanging out, that networking, that moving and interacting with each other that really made our events so special. So we landed on this platform called Remo, which allows you to basically move around a virtual space and have that video and that audio and that voice and ability to present. So there's some element of user control there. So now actually we're working with clients all around the world, and our community gatherings, which were previously limited primarily to the greater Boston area, we now have people dialing in from all over the United States, outside the United States, really all over the world as well. And that was really key for us to be able to not completely recreate what we were doing in the past with in-person events, because it's never going to be exactly the same, but look at that as an opportunity for a way to connect with each other in a new way that still felt fresh and interactive and engaging.
Awesome. So yeah, great to hear from her there. Now, one thing I'm really hyper aware of is I imagine that many of you kind of face similar challenges, maybe not exactly in the same way that Felicia did. Of course, their challenge was, how do you network in this new world, and how do they create tools for people to do so? But I'm wondering, do you have kind of similar ways of doing business that were totally interrupted that you solved in some way with a new tool or a new technology? Definitely chat in, share with your peers here and us as well. While you're contributing, though, I can offer just the last couple tips on this front. So while not all encompassing, just a few things that you can keep in mind. If your issue is you're not sure what technologies and tools to kind of focus on, you might have only a certain bit of time in the week or a certain bit of money that your team has access to. Make sure you're ranking them by kind of how much cost it would take to implement them versus the potential impact, and being pretty concrete about that as best as you can. Second is, when we think about this awareness and how much you need to know about other technologies adjacent to you, a baseline is you should be around 20% proficient with whatever they are. Now, that's inherently vague and will differ on each kind of type of technology, but it should give you an idea for, okay, you should have an understanding of the basics and what it's all about, its limitations. And lastly, no matter how big or small this effort is, whether it's organization-wide or just personal, make sure there's a way to measure success and failure with it so that you can use a different tool or feel valid in the tool you're using. So before we wrap up, were there any comments there, Abby, that you saw come in?
Yes, there were. Let's see. Michelle says, had to revise all course materials to the virtual space and get creative with Zoom to keep courses engaging. I think we can really relate to that, Michelle. Chart Chai says they began to adopt Zoom and MS Teams. Diana says virtual interviews and virtual new hire orientations versus all in person. Carla says we began using GoTo training to combine our classes in 2 locations. This is something we plan to continue. I think that's really interesting to think about, like in our work lives and in our personal lives, which changes that we adopted as a result of the pandemic will keep going. So it's great. Thanks for weighing in there.
100%. Great to hear, yeah, how you've all been overcoming those challenges. So yeah, to just quickly wrap things up, one, again, thank you so much for all of your time. We'd love now to turn to some of the questions you had throughout the presentation. But you can see here, this is the framework that we've been chatting about. We hope that it is useful to you and your organizations. You don't necessarily need to adopt it lockstep, but maybe it can inspire your own efforts that you're in the middle of right now.
Starting with Morris, he asked the question around and said, we have a massive digital transformation in our company. The challenge is the mix of the population, as we have employees with no technology experience. Our digital transformation is not a migration from other technologies, but a complete implementation. And some employees don't even have a corporate email. How do you prepare a company to be ready and receptive? And how do we get the organization engaged?
Yeah, I think that is an excellent question. And I don't think you're alone in facing a challenge like that. When you have a massive initiative like that, one of the most important things is making sure that the executives put in place space across just about every team for people to have the ability to learn. So you have people who may not have these email addresses. I spoke with a friend whose company, they didn't even have computers when they were transitioning to digital. You need to make sure that all those individuals have space to maybe work a little slowly for those first few months, maybe have really intentional training courses with others in your organization. A great way that I've heard of doing so is doing peer learning, where you partner up individuals to make sure that there's a little bit of connection and community, but also learning best practices for how to work on new machines. One note I'll make too is when you have a big initiative like that, it's so important not to think of it as just this generational divide. Where certain generations need more help than others. That's not the case. When you think of younger individuals coming into the workplace, they have struggles with digital intelligence as well. So making sure that you aren't singling any generation out and that you're giving space for learning, I think are 2 great ways.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Suzanne asked a great question, which I think we can all relate to. With people returning to the offices now, how do you suggest balancing a remote culture with an in-person one?
Yeah, this is really close to home, and I imagine it is to many of us. One thing Abby and I are struggling with right now is we used to have some celebrations in person at the end of when we released new material or courses, but now some of our team is remote, some are in the office. How do we do so in a respectful way? I think the key is to start having conversations around processes that you've never had before. So let's say that all of your meetings now are going to be 2 people in an office, 3 people remote, in varying levers there. You need to have ways to make sure that everybody can get their opinions in. Maybe it's raising a hand on screen, or maybe there's using the chat functionality, making sure that people in the conference room have their computers open. So it's setting those standards in place and making sure that everybody agrees on them at the beginning of every conversation.
That definitely makes sense. Thank you. Jeremy asked the question, I feel like my team jumps to a lot of new tools because they're trending. How do we make sure that the tools that we choose are the right ones?
Yeah, and I definitely hear that. I think that it's really tempting, especially when you hear, on the news or in your industry that like this is really valuable, to just jump on it. But this is where that scientist thinking comes into play. So have a hypothesis with it. Make sure that hypothesis has merit. Run it by a bunch of people in your organization. If your organization does end up going and adopting something, make sure there's a clear way of kind of pulling the chute, the parachute, to say, okay, this isn't for us. We can still pivot and use something more valuable. So do it for the right reasons. Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the last question, Melissa asks, I like the ideas here, but frankly, I don't know if many teams in my organization have time and resources to experiment with new technologies, even if they want to. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's really important, and this is mainly for executives that you'll need to chat with in your organization, is if you have a digital transformation effort, there needs to be time to make it happen. So if your organization is going to be serious about using technology in new ways, you can't just say that and then be like, all right, teams, experiment. You need to give them the time and space. On the other hand, if you're on one of those teams and you don't have the time and space, you can experiment in really small ways, just setting aside 15 minutes a day to keep up on certain blogs, or thinking, okay, this month we're going to try this new tool. We're going to only allocate this time, and time box it really intentionally so it doesn't spin out of control.
Great suggestion, Ryan. We're about at time here, but any final thoughts, Ryan or Abby, before we end today's session?
Really quick, just one, thank you so much for everybody who attended. It was great hearing some of your stories and to have you join us. I'll say that when I started working on digital intelligence, or even before it was called that, I didn't know if I saw all of the merit in it. I thought, okay, this is just how to use tech. I get it. Some people do know how, some people just need more time, but it's so much more than that. There are human skills here that we all can work on, no matter where we are, and habits that we can all put in place that can actually make a difference. And that's kind of what I've left developing the course with. But Abby, I'll turn it over to you too.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I totally agree with you about thinking about it in terms of human skills. And to that, I would just add a thank you to everyone for chiming in with your questions, and really appreciate your openness and sharing what your challenges are, where you had success going through this journey. So thank you, and thank you to Open Sesame for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Well, of course, Ryan, thank you, and Abby as well. We sincerely appreciate your thoughts and insights. And thanks to everyone from around the globe for joining us for our 5th Learning Unlocked session for 2021. We have a lot more coming up this month, so be sure to tune in for additional sessions every Tuesday and Thursday in June. Next up, this Thursday, we have IntelliZ's own Pam Conway and Davis Smith, who will dive into how strong leadership, mitigate disruption, and support digital transformation and unlock employees' potential within your organization. I also want to give a huge shout out to all of our incredible sponsors. We're so happy to have you supporting Learning Unlocked, including our great sponsor for today's event, Harvard Business Publishing. And as a final reminder for everyone, you will receive today's slides and recording via email within the next couple of days. We hope to see you again for more Learning Unlocked sessions. Thanks again and take care. We'll see you next time.